All right, good afternoon. That was half-hearted. Good afternoon. That's much better. All right. Those of you who are regulars know what's coming next. Those of you who are new will hear this if you come back. Please silence your cell phones now. The first one whose phone goes off in the middle of the program gets pretzels thrown at him. Okay. So next week at Lunch with Books, Tuesday, December 14th at noon, we're celebrating the 230th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, one day early. It was ratified on December 15th, 1791. Dr. Anne Marie LaFosso, professor of law at West Virginia University, will be with us next week to commemorate the occasion. She was one of our instructors for the People's University last summer on women's rights. So that's a great reminder that this Thursday, December 9th, at 7 p.m., right here in the library auditorium, we're having Class 2 of People's University, the Cold War. Dr. Barry Capel will be with us again. He'll be teaching the name of the class is The Wars of Containment. That's Class 2 in our 8-week series. If you didn't come to week 1, don't worry, you can still come to Class 2. Dr. Capel's great. It'll be a good talk. There are brochures on the table with the schedules of classes. Come to the ones that you want. You don't have to do them in order. So 7 p.m. here in the auditorium. We're also broadcasting online. It'll be on YouTube and Facebook. That's December 9th, this Thursday at 7 p.m. Then the following Tuesday, December 21st, we have our Holiday Lunch with Books program. Don Feenerty will be back with us in person this year. Last year it was virtual, but it was very popular for the second annual Simple Life Holiday Special. This program is based on the Firefox books that were written or compiled by former Wheeling resident Brooks Wigington. So Fairmay will be here as his musical guest. He just does a lot of folk crafts and fun things. And if you know Don Feenerty, he's a very funny guy. So it'll be a fun program. That's December 21st at noon. And then the next week, we'll have 2 musical programs in a row. We'll have Eli Lambie, who's a pianist, and he'll be doing lesser-known West Virginia anthems to prepare us for the first Lunch with Books of 2022, Tuesday, January 4th, which is Country Roads, Take Me Home. If you know that song, it turned 50 years old this year, so we're going to have somebody come and tell us about the history of that song. That's January 4th, 2022. So I know you'll remember all of that, and I expect you to be here for all of those. Okay. Today's guest is James Siekmeier. He received his PhD in history from Cornell in 1993, specializing in the history of U.S. foreign relations towards Latin America. He has taught at colleges and universities in Washington, D.C., New York, Iowa, Texas, and Bolivia, and on 2 Fulbright grants where he taught courses on Native American history in Spanish. He has published The Bolivian Revolution in the United States, 1952 to the present. That was through Penn State University Press, 2011. And Latin American Nationalism, Identity and Globalizing the World, Bloomsburg, 2017, published that. He is an associate professor of history at West Virginia University, and he's currently working on a book on U.S. anti-drug efforts in South America in the 1960s through the 1990s. Please welcome Professor Siekmeier.
Thank you all so much. I assume you can hear me because I try and project. Microphones tend to be kind of too far away, but I just project. And also just, I tend to like to give a few remarks. I also want to keep things short, and then I'll go through the PowerPoint later. So you have to listen to the text, and then you get rewarded with the pictures, right? The pictures I use as a way of kind of drilling down on some of the points that I'm going to make, my general points. Well, of course, the Pearl Harbor attacks were so important in American history, and it's like the 9/11 attacks for our generation. I remember where I was at 9/11. Most people here do as well, I'm sure. Anyone here remember Pearl Harbor? So you probably remember where you were, right? I talked with my mom recently, and she remembers the school assembly, in which they, go ahead. Oh, you have, okay. Okay. This is better. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, people remember where they were. So, obviously, it was an incredibly important turning point in American history because it's what got the United States into World War II officially. As any of you know, your history of the United States, tensions between the United States and Nazi Germany very high. The United States was aiding Great Britain in the early 1940s, and also it had built up its military in the Pacific, fearing there would be a war with Japan. But Pearl Harbor is what really brought us into it. So there's a lot of ways of looking at Pearl Harbor. So I'm just going to boil it down to 3 ways, and I want to make this also a conversation. So if you all have things you want to say, please say them. I'm not an expert in military history, so I'm going to talk more about diplomacy and foreign relations, but obviously bringing the military history in. So I'm just going to break it down to three general ways of looking at it. First of all, the sneak attack. Second of all, backdoor to war. And third of all, U.S.-Japanese relations. So obviously it was a sneak attack. The sheer brutality of it shocked not just the United States, but the world. And also something that perhaps caused the United States to use atomic bombs on Japan at the end of the war to end the war very quickly. The backdoor to war theory briefly is that it's a conspiracy theory that the Roosevelt administration wanted the United States to get into war, World War II, and so it kept its ships purposely lined up in Pearl Harbor as an easy target to the Japanese, and then when the Japanese bombed them, it was very dramatic and changed U.S. public opinion dramatically from isolationism to we need to join the war. Now, I don't agree with that theory, but I just want to throw it out there because a lot has been written on that. And the third way of looking at it is sort of U.S.-Japanese relations. Interestingly, U.S.-Japanese relations were quite harmonious in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then they got tense in the 1930s, and then afterwards, once we get into the Cold War, U.S.-Japanese relations turned out to be quite harmonious again. So there's a bit of sort of irony and a sort of a circling back of history, which I think is really interesting. One thing that's consistent with U.S.-Japanese relations, which you might think is kind of funny to talk on Pearl Harbor, is baseball. The Japanese were baseball crazy before World War II, going back to the 1920s and 1930s, and then, of course, after World War II, one of the great baseball-playing nations of the world. So that's been something that's been consistent despite the obvious, the conflict and the wartime experience of the United States and Japan. Anyone here seen the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C.? Virtually everybody. I used to live in D.C., and when I'd go there, when the blossoms were in bloom, I was always photobombing people because I couldn't get out of the way of all the tourists taking pictures of the cherry blossoms, right? Those were a gift of the government of Japan, and it was out of a feeling of friendliness and harmony. Goes back to 1912, William Howard Taft, if you're keeping notes. And so that's sort of a permanent reminder of, the fact that Japan and the United States have had many years of harmonious relations. One thing that really sent the Japanese in a direction that the United States very much disliked and hated, shall we say, was the Great Depression. So Japan wanted to industrialize, it wanted to imitate the United States and the West. It was doing a pretty good job of it in the late 19th. Early 20th century. It by far was the most industrialized Asian nation and wanted to imitate the West, not just the United States, but Europe as well, much more than any other nation. And so the United States is like, we can do business with these people. And literally, they did do a lot of business with the Japanese, especially in finance. In the 1920s, the Japanese borrowed a lot of money from the New York banks to build their industrial plant, which later, after World War II was rebuilt, became one of the most powerful in Asia, if not the world, right? Then the Depression happens, and of course, everything changes. The Depression happens, the money dries up, the Japanese have no access to funds from the United States or London. They were getting them from various places. And so it basically went off on an imperialist spree, shall we say. And the Japanese called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is a mouthful, right? But basically, it's imperialism. The Japanese are as you know, a small group of islands, but a large population, densely populated. They need access to foodstuffs. They need access to fuel for their industrial plant. They need access to oil. They need access to a lot of things, and they wanted to control it. And part of it, too, was you might call sort of Japanese manifest destiny, this idea of spreading Japanese culture by force. And so the Japanese took over large chunks of China, some of you probably know from your study of American history, but not just China. You have Indonesia, you have Indochina, you have Korea, and by the time you get to the early 1940s, U.S.-Japanese relations are very tense because the United States is publicly chastising Japan for its invasions of these countries. And in some cases, it wasn't an invasion, it was use of Japanese economic power, using Japanese economic power to get a good deal on oil from Indonesia, to get a good deal on foodstuffs from China, or whatever. For their part, the Japanese were very unhappy that the United States was aiding China against Japan. But what really brought things to a head was Indochina. The Japanese invasion of Indochina in 1940. Of course, Indochina becomes important later on with the Vietnam War, but that's a different conversation. With the Japanese invasion into China, the point of the United States foreign policymakers is, this is ridiculous. You know, we can't take this anymore. This will not stand. The United States is not that blunt, but basically says this will not stand. For their part, the Japanese continued their negotiations until December 6th, in which case the Japanese basically cut off their negotiations because, of course, they know the Pearl Harbor attacks are coming. Japan makes a fatal miscalculation with the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was the idea that perhaps if the Japanese could shall we say, strike the United States so hard, and hit them so badly and hurt them so much, it would force the United States to sort of roll over and say, you know, we're not going to fight you. Now, it sounds crazy today for us to say that how could the Japanese think this? But it's important to keep it in mind that U.S. opinion at this time, up until the Pearl Harbor attack, until December 7th, was isolationist. The Republican Party at this time was controlled by isolationists who did not want the United States to go to war, no matter what. I mentioned Charles Lindbergh before, the famous aviator, but there's lots of famous Americans who are very isolationist. You can go back and Gerald Ford, who was a student at the time, isolationist, later becomes president, of course. And so Franklin Roosevelt, for the last 10 years, have been trying to get the United States to assume a more wartime stance, and U.S. public opinion was not buying it, was not accepting it. So once Pearl Harbor happens, everything changes. Another thing from the point of view of the Japanese, which is, it's hard to understand why they would strike Pearl Harbor and lead themselves into disaster, right? The United States had been slowly cutting off trade. It wasn't an outright boycott, but by 1941, it was an outright boycott. 1941, the United States made the fateful decision. It doesn't sound like that dramatic to look back and say we're cutting off all exports of iron and oil to you, Japan. And this was a source of, not the only source for Japan, but it was an important source of fuel and steel, iron, for their industrial plant. And the Japanese realized with that cutoff in mid-1941, it was sort of a Fisher-cut bait. We can either withdraw our troops from all over East Asia, or we can try and hit the United States so hard, like I said before, perhaps they'll be intimidated, and we can, get them to not fight us in the Pacific. One reason for this miscalculation on the part of the Japanese, many historians have spent a lot of time going back. How could the Japanese miscalculate this, right? And it's not something that you see often explicitly stated by policymakers or so much, but I would call it a mutual racism. The United States never thought the Japanese were capable of striking Hawaii because they didn't think that racially they were as equal to Caucasians. But the Japanese, for their part, were also racist because of the way they looked at the United States, and this is a generalization, but there's a lot of evidence for this amongst Japanese intellectuals and Japanese political leaders. The United States was a soft society. Caucasians didn't have a warrior tradition like the Japanese, right? The Japanese would be tougher fighters than the United States. And the Japanese looked down upon the United States too, because it was well, they would probably say a mongrel society. It was a society of lots of different races. The Japanese looked down upon Latino Americans and African Americans. It's even lower in their eyes than Caucasians. And so you take the whole mix together, you can understand how some Japanese might think that, okay, even if we do fight these people, we could win, right? So that was another reason for the, shall we say, the mutual racism and the mutual miscalculation. Because there's a miscalculation on the part of the United States to leave Hawaii exposed, right? the way the United States looked at it was, okay, the Japanese are going to hit us. There was intelligence information on this, right? But the assumption was it would be somewhere closer to Japan. You know, it would be the Philippines. Is an obvious place, but maybe somewhere else, but not Hawaii, right? Okay, so with the attack itself, 7 ships were severely damaged. 2 of them, I'll go over this more in the PowerPoint, the Arizona and Oklahoma were never recovered. The others, including the USS West Virginia, were recovered and later used in the war, not till like 1944, but they were used in the war. So if you want to look at the sheer numbers of the brutality and how this is a turning point in American history, Pearl Harbor, the estimates that I've looked at, 24,000 people were killed, the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, going back to the Battle of Antietam, not that far away from here, or Battle of Sharpsburg, in Maryland, September of 1862. 22,000 were killed there. And then the 9/11 attacks, 3,000 were 9/11, 2001 attacks, about 3,000 were killed, so more than at Pearl Harbor. So one way of looking at Pearl Harbor, and which I really like actually, there was an old expert in U.S. foreign relations, George Kennan. He worked in the State Department for a while, came up with the doctrine of containment of communism after World War II. But after he left government service, he was a very good scholar, wrote a number of books on history of American foreign relations and international history. He said, well, if you look at U.S. foreign policy, not just during World War II, but you can go back to the very beginning, he said, it's like a dinosaur stuck in the mud. And if there's a dinosaur stuck in the mud, you can whack at it all you want, and it's not going to do anything. You can whack it really hard, and it's going to glare at you. Maybe it's going to raise its head. If you want that dinosaur to move, you got to like cut off its tail. And then once you cut off that dinosaur's tail, it's going to rear up and it's going to destroy you. So that's the way he sort of looked at U.S. foreign policy. So there's years of inaction or avoiding contact with the rest of the world. But once you get the United States, engaged, then the United States is going to go to war with full force. And I think that's a good way of looking at World War II. So a little bit on the military history of World War II, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. So if you want to talk more about it in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. U.S. declares war on Japan on December 8th, of course. 3 days later, Germany declares war on the United States. Historians have sort of wondered about the German declaration of war. Some historians simply say, well, Hitler was very erratic and it's hard to explain anything he did in some ways, right? But Germany was angry at the United States because it had been helping Britain fight Germany going back to 1940, right? However, Japan and Germany also had a pact called the Tripartite Pact going back to 1940, which did not say Japan, Germany, and Italy would go to war together, but because the United States and Japan were at war, and there was this pact that Germany had with Japan, Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th, 3 days after the United States declares war on Japan. So then the United States very quickly is in a worldwide war. The United States focuses on Europe first, in part because the United States has been helping Great Britain, as I just mentioned, and also just from a strategic point of view, U.S. military leaders thought, well, let's work on Europe. This is something that's doable, and then we're going to focus more on Asia. It was a two-front war, but first the focus was in Europe, then shifts to, and after that was basically one, then shifted to the Pacific. So in the pressure of combat, soldiers often rise to the occasion and display valor. I had an uncle who fought in the Pacific Theater in Okinawa. I heard many stories of valor from him. I had a former boss who also fought in Okinawa, coincidentally. And kind of interestingly, I was talking to my boss, and he said, he was in the Army. He said, well, Okinawa was really hard for the Army because the Japanese knew that the Marines were tough, so they hid. And then the Marines took it really easily, and then the Army had a real hard time taking Okinawa. I told this to my uncle, and he said, you can tell your boss he's full of hooey. It was really hard for the Marines, and I was in the Marines, and I've told you that many times. So there's many examples of valor, right? But there's also an important element of race war that one sees in the Pacific that you don't see in Europe, obviously, because the armies are the same race. There was a kind of take no prisoners attitude on the part of the United States and the Japanese in the Pacific. There's quite a number of examples of severing body parts, and I don't want to get too gruesome with this, but it was a much sort of bloodier and more tooth and nail type conflict in the Pacific compared to Europe. And part of this goes back to this mutual racism that I talked about before. Both the Japanese and the United States look down upon the other in racial terms. And then if you look at it in that way, if you conclude your enemy is racially inferior, then you're not going to perhaps obey the laws of war, the rules of war, the Geneva Convention. That's going to be more of a all-out, tooth and nail, bloody conflict. All right, I want to come back to my 3 ways of looking at Pearl Harbor. And again, this is only just 3 ways for lunchtime talk, and if you want to talk about more things, let's make it a conversation afterwards. Sneak attack, backdoor war, and then U.S.-Japanese relations more generally. So sneak attack, definitely it was. And that's one thing that got the United States public so enraged with Japan and the world, enraged with Japan, right? And I had a couple students actually looking at the decision for dropping the atomic bombs on Japan in August of 1945. They looked at President Truman's diary. He was the decider, of course, at that time. And there's a couple phrases in there in which Truman says, because of the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, Truman doesn't use the word retribution, but basically the idea is, we can hit them hard with atomic bombs. Now, the main reason the bombs were used is to end the war quickly, right? However, there is that element of they hit us hard, perhaps we're justified in trying out this amazingly audacious and powerful weapon, the only time nuclear weapons have ever been used in world history. Backdoor war, I talked about that before. This idea of conspiracy theory that Franklin Roosevelt left the battleships in Pearl Harbor as a sitting duck for the Japanese. I don't agree with that. I think it's been debunked by historians. One thing to realize is oftentimes with these sort of theories, it's sort of history, hindsight is 20/20, because you can go to the Roosevelt administration, the archives, Roosevelt Library and National Archives, and after Pearl Harbor, you can find a few officials who are saying privately, not publicly, but they're saying, well, Pearl Harbor was terrible, loss of life, tragedy, and it shows us to be so unready. But at least now everyone in the United States is on the same page. We're in World War II with all 4 feet, right? And so historians look at that and they say, aha, this shows that Franklin Roosevelt wanted the Japanese to strike Pearl Harbor, because then it would be a dramatic event. But that's sort of reading the present back into the past, and that's bad history. Another thing you could talk about in that regard was the aircraft carriers had been recently dispersed around the Pacific. So it would have been a lot worse if the aircraft carriers were in Pearl Harbor and the battleships. So I think it's very unlikely that this backdoor war carries any weight at all. And finally, the irony of U.S.-Japanese relations is something that I like to talk about, because, like I said, U.S.-Japanese relations were very close, late 19th, early 20th century. There were disputes over immigration at the time, and U.S. immigration was keeping out all Asians, and it was racist, and the Japanese were unhappy. Theodore Roosevelt, however, worked it out with the Japanese, and then Roosevelt's successor, Taft, received those cherry blossoms I talked about, right? And then, of course, during World War II, U.S.-Japanese relations are brutally violent. But then after, the United States is quite close to Japan. Japan becomes a very important ally in East Asia. Japan is firmly anti-communist. The United States puts a security umbrella relationship over Japan, because once China goes communist, the Japanese feel very isolated by, or encircled by, shall we say, the Soviet Union and the Chinese, right? And then, of course, those cultural connections as well, such as baseball, become stronger in the post-war period. Okay, what I want to do now is briefly end my verbal comments, and then I'm going to go to the PowerPoint and talk about some of the images that I'd like to show you. Some conclusions. Well, one thing is the U.S., conclusions with regard to the importance of Pearl Harbor. One thing is the United States had to fight the war with what it had. If you lose most of your battleships, it wasn't every single one, but virtually all the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were damaged, right? Then you fight with aircraft carriers, and you fight with submarines. And starting December 8th, the military was like, wow, this is going to be rough. We're going to have to just do it with what we got. But it worked out okay. And then the battleships came in at the end, right? And so that influenced the way the military thought about future wars. Aircraft carriers, submarines are going to become more important. But battleships obviously are still important too. The legacy Pearl Harbor 2 I mentioned a minute ago about the fact that it was such a brutal sneak attack perhaps led the United States to use nuclear bombs, which is another sort of dramatic turning point in world history 4 years later. Also, another important aspect of Pearl Harbor that some people might not think about much these days because it's been 80 years, but for a while this is really in the news and in the mix. The intelligence gathering system of the United States was rejiggered, reformulated, rationalized. By the time you get to 1947, you have the Central Intelligence Agency. And the reason why it's called Central is because it coordinates all the different intelligence units and the different government agencies into one overhead agency. Well, it still can be kind of a mess and complicated. I used to work in DC myself, so I know the bureaucracy can be a disaster. But at least theoretically, things are centralized. Intelligence gathering and analysis of information you get through spying, right, is done in a much more rational way to avoid future Pearl Harbor. So there's a parallel to the 9/11 attacks, right? After 9/11, there was also the whole question about how could this happen, right? How could our intelligence community not figure this out? Well, the answer is sort of like with Pearl Harbor. The intelligence agencies in 1940 were collecting information the Japanese are going to strike somewhere, but they don't know where. Same thing with leading up to the 9/11 attacks. Intelligence agencies in this country, we now know from either leaked information or people have talked about it and written about it. The United States knew that there was some interest on the part of Al-Qaeda and these fundamentalist Muslim groups to perhaps attack the United States, but they didn't know when or where or the details. Right? And after 9/11, the intelligence community is again reformulated. There's the National Director of Intelligence, in which the CIA is under that, to hopefully streamline the process and avoid another 9/11. Another legacy of Pearl Harbor, which is something I was reading about this recently, and it's like, hey, this makes sense. I never really thought about it this way, but it sort of forced the United States to, shall we say, fish or cut bait when it comes to its colonies in the Pacific. Now, the United States likes to use a euphemism. They're not called colonies or territories. It was called the territory of Hawaii, the territory of the Philippines, back when those were colonies. Now, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States. It's called a free associated state. It sounds like a colony, free associated state. So the whole point of colonies is, of course, to advance U.S. economic interests and also to make the United States look like it's a great power, sort of like its attributes of a great power, shall we say. But the colonies were hard for the United States to maintain and defend, right? And so after World War II, basically, so not so much a legacy of Pearl Harbor, but legacy of World War II, U.S. officials say, okay, we're going to like fish or cut bait when it comes to our colonies. Philippines can become independent. And the plans for making them independent go back to before World War II. Hawaii is going to become a state of the United States. It's not going to be in this sort of like limbo zone of it's a territory, how much are we defending it, how much do we really care about it. Philippines, it's on its own. Hawaii, the state of the United States. And of course, I want to keep coming back to this idea of the harmony of U.S.-Japanese relations after World War II. You would think with the sneak attack of Pearl Harbor, U.S.-Japanese relations would be horrible for years after that, and certainly there was some conflict there. But really, U.S.-Japanese relations after World War II were some of the most harmonious of any country in the world, up there with Britain, Canada, and Japan. History, which again cycles back to the late 19th century, the early 20th century with those cherry blossoms. So history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes, shall we say, it rhymes. It's from Mark Twain. So let me go through this, and I don't want to stand in the way. What's the point? How do I get out of the way here? There you go. Okay, that's one of the iconic Pearl Harbor pictures, USS Arizona, if you're taking notes. Okay, this is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And of course, this is what really caused the United States and the British and the French and others to get very, very angry with Japan. This is at its height. So it really starts in about 1910 with, you see Korea next to Japan. Japan invades Korea in 1910, militarily takes it over. It is a colony of Japan going back to 1910 and remains a colony until 1945 after World War II. Then Manchuria, which is that big blob there to the north of Japan, invaded in 1931 by the Japanese. And this was something which some historians say that is the beginning of World War II in East Asia, and maybe the beginning of World War II overall. The world was outraged at basically Japan severing part of China. China this time was in revolution, it was weak, it couldn't control its territory that well. The Japanese wanted land, they wanted coal mines and fuel sources. They wanted resources, but they also wanted a buffer because Japanese relations with China weren't that great, and so it was a sort of buffer zone as well. So from those two, from Korea and Manchuria, it grows to this big area. So this is the height of it in 1942. Now you're like, baseball? So who is that in the middle? Babe Ruth. There's a great picture of Babe Ruth holding a Japanese umbrella. It's another classic. So U.S. baseball teams, professional and minor league teams, went in the 1920s and 1930s because the Japanese loved baseball. And Babe Ruth was one of their heroes, right? Now this is at a time when U.S.-Japanese relations are really bad because the United States is very angry at Japan's invasion of Manchuria. The world is angry at the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Yet you have those social and cultural connections. So one reason I mention this is, military history is very important, but also there's other ways of looking at the relationship between countries, right? There's foreign relations, treaties and trade agreements, but there's also cultural stuff, for lack of a better word, right? Cultural, social interaction. And, there's lots of ways we can look at U.S.-Japanese interaction. Of course, Japanese cartoons and artwork is really important all over the world right today. But back in this time period, baseball is kind of a shorthand for like how the United States and Japan were connected socially and or culturally. Japan's attack on Shanghai, August 1937. I want to show this picture because this was one of those iconic pictures that really changed the way many people looked at the situation in East Asia. Before this picture, many people, like, well, China's a long ways away. How much do I really care about the fact that Japan is invading China? This crying child was something that was on the front page of newspapers around the world. Franklin Roosevelt apparently was very, very angered and dismayed by this picture. So it sort of began moving U.S. opinion away from let's try to ignore the world to we need to engage. The rape of Nanjing, 1937, horrible year for Japan, Chinese relations, or horrible year for China because Japan is invading it. And China, like I said, is in revolution this time and can't defend itself that well. 300,000 Chinese killed, and it's known as the Nanjing Massacre, which is incredible. And there's also looting, like I have here, rape and destruction of property. Okay, so Pearl Harbor attack, getting to what, today's talk, the meat of the matter. 350 planes, 6 aircraft carriers, and 2 waves of the attack were used on the morning of December 7th, 1941. This is a picture actually from a Japanese propaganda film in which they are glorifying the attack on Pearl Harbor for their own people. And later this was found in the archives, and then stills were taken of it and found their way into archives in this country. So that's a plane taking off. And there's a soldier over there watching a plane taking off from the Japanese point of view. And more pictures from the Japanese side. This is a famous picture some of you might have seen because that explosion there, some people say that's the first attack. Now this is from the perspective of the Japanese. And I'm no expert on Japan, but I see Japanese writing down there, so hey, it's Japanese. And I did a little research. This was found in the Foreign Ministry archives in Japan. So historians found it after the war. And according to one of the internet sites I read, the Japanese lettering is sort of like a stamp saying, this is okay for public release. Like with US documents, there's a declassified stamp, okay, public release, that's basically the declassified stamp. But I'm not fluent in Japanese. In fact, I don't read it at all. So I'll have to take their word for it. So here is a sequence of photos of what it looked like from the point of view of the Japanese. airmen, right? There's the ships, battleships all lined up. More attacks. There's the ships there. And attacks getting worse, right? More attacks. I mentioned this before. I think 2 battleships were not recovered at Arizona, Oklahoma. They were so damaged, the Navy decided they couldn't be recovered. 5 other ships, I have here sunk, I should say sunk or damaged, later recovered and used in the War of the Pacific, including the USS West Virginia. USS Arizona, I found a few color pictures. I couldn't figure out if they were colorized later or they taken color at the time, but they're pretty dramatic because they're in color, right? The Arizona, never recovered. This is the USS Oklahoma, USS Oklahoma. Actually, I had this wrong. That's the USS California. I put a question mark there. I checked later. Also never recovered. This is the USS West Virginia and the USS Tennessee lined up next to each other. And you can see the ships there, people trying to save sailors. And honoring the dead at Pearl Harbor. This is a year after the attack. This is a ceremony on Hawaii where most of the remains were buried and most remain today. However, there's been efforts in the last few years. I was doing some research going back to 2003, pretty recent actually. And I just read an article quite recently that the military has now closed its efforts to try and identify remains. But until this year, basically until 2021, the US military was using DNA technology to try and identify remains, and some have been repatriated to the families in the United States. A family in Texas, a family in other parts of the country, I can't remember. So there have been forensic studies done of the work like mass graves, but sometimes bodies were put in large containers, and DNA technology was very, very helpful in figuring out the remains. Okay, so brutality of the Pearl Harbor attack. Facilitate the brutality of how the war was fought in the Pacific Theater. I talked about that sort of element of racial conflict or race war. Many people in the United States their attitude was, if the Japanese are going to attack us with a sneak attack, a brutal sneak attack, then we can use very brutal tactics against them, including later atomic bombs. Since this is lunch with books, I got to include some books. I didn't even include all the books that I want to include because I figured out I could go on forever and you'd get bored and fall asleep and everything. So let's not do that. War Without Mercy, written, like over 30 years ago. John Dower teaches the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They do have a history program there at MIT. It's a very, very strong one, actually. Race and Power in the Pacific War. And he looks at Japanese sources and U.S. sources. And this is where I got the idea 30 years ago for this idea of a mutual race war, mutual racism. Both sides look down upon the other in racist terms. Both sides saw the other as racially inferior. Dower is fluent in Japanese, spent a lot of time in Japanese archives, but also U.S. archives. So it was the first book that I remember where he looks at both sides and extensive research in both sides with regard to how the war was fought in the Pacific. There's the atomic bomb, of course, culmination of World War II and the end of World War II. Conventional bombing, if you want some numbers, 620 casualties, atomic bombs, 180 casualties, so the Japanese lost a total of 800,000 casualties during World War II, not including the military. This is civilian. After the war, what happens after Pearl Harbor? Recovered bodies, I talked a little bit about that. U.S. intelligence system reform to make it more rational, make the different units talk to each other more. Let's get the Naval Intelligence, Office of Naval Intelligence talking to the Army Intelligence Unit, talking to the Air Force, talking to the State Department, organizing that. Leads to the CIA in 1947. The occupation, spent a whole talk just in the occupation of Japan. Entire books have been written on the occupation of Japan. The U.S. occupation was one of the more successful in, I would even say, world history. That the Japanese began to imitate the United States. Well, they were doing that before the war anyway, culturally and socially. But the famous picture of, oops, this is what we don't want to think about. This is one of the divers finding identifying remains. And well, I'll come back to the famous picture of MacArthur and the Japanese emperor. It's sort of like, I'm the big guy and I'm the small guy, and the big guy is going to kind of control the small guy. But actually, MacArthur knew Japan very well, and the constitution that he helped to have implemented allowed women the right to vote. Is a very progressive constitution, and many Japanese were actually quite thankful for the nature of the U.S. occupation, which wasn't as brutal as they thought. So I'm not sure if you can read these, but this gets at my point about how the intelligence system, the spying system, the intelligence gathering system needed a lot of work back in 1941. Basically, war was imminent on December 6, 1941. The Japanese sent what they called a 14-point message, which basically said we're cutting off negotiations. The Japanese and the United States were in negotiations in Washington, D.C. and other places to try and reduce tensions in Asia, but both sides were so angry at the other, negotiations weren't really very effective. Basically cut off on December 6th. Therefore, the White House and the military leadership in D.C. wants to get the information to Pearl Harbor as quickly as possible. Early morning of December 7th, 1941, Signals Intelligence Service, you don't have to read this entire thing, they recognized the importance of the Japan's 14-point message, not a declaration of war, but basically, we're cutting off negotiations and we don't really see any point in continuing them ever again. So it's almost a declaration of war, right? So the information gets out kind of slowly, dispatched by bicycle messenger to Fort Shafter. Halfway to his destination, the bicycle messenger, imagine this guy riding his bike, and then the bombs start going off, and so he has to hide in a ditch. So by the time the information about the negotiations in D.C. being terminated, which happened on December 6th, gets to Hawaii on December 7th, the war has already started. Japan, the attack is already over, basically. So this is why after the war, there was a soul searching on the part of U.S. government officials. How can we ensure that we have better communications and quicker communications so we can get information to people who need it more quickly? And I like to put the source in here. This is U.S. Army. As I tell my students, if you have sources that are .mil, it's military.edu is education, .gov, those are good sources.
I have one question.
Yeah.
It was brought up Saturday at a meeting. The person said that while Japanese ambassadors were meeting in Washington, D.C. at that time, Roosevelt knew that they were going to attack, and he wanted to be brought into the war.
No, I don't think Roosevelt knew.
He didn't know that?
I don't think he knew, no. I don't think anyone knew of the attack before, except the Japanese. They planned it, so they knew. But virtually no one on the United States side knew the attack was coming. So, okay. Intelligence system again. Perhaps you think I'm talking a lot about this, but I used to work for the State Department as an historian. I had a security clearance, so I was part of the intelligence community. I looked at old secret documents, historical ones. So maybe for me, the intelligence system is really important. Two parts of it: collection and distribution. Then the Central Intelligence Agency formed, in part because the congressional hearings held after Pearl Harbor. How could this happen? How could we prevent this happening again? Let's reform the intelligence gathering and distribution system, and that leads to the CIA. U.S. occupation. I showed you this picture before, MacArthur and the Emperor. One thing the United States aimed to do was to humanize the Emperor. Before the war, the Emperor was such a godlike figure to the Japanese, you didn't look him straight in the face. Like when he would come down in a parade or any sort of procession, the Japanese would turn away. You'd think they're turning away because they hate him. No, they're turning away out of respect because you're not supposed to look him in the face. So MacArthur tried to change that by making the emperor, shall we say, a figurehead in a constitutional monarchy. And the United States was largely successful in that after the war. U.S. occupation. Japanese realized they benefited from hitching their star to the United States. One reason for this is the war was so devastating for Japan physically, so many people killed, military and civilian, and their ideology, their way of looking at the world, this ultra-nationalist military expansion was blown out of the water. So they were sort of in a fog. Like, where do we turn to? Well, let's go with the United States. and that helps the United States and Japan forge a productive relationship. And Japan's one of the few countries today, well, there's a North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe, right, which would guarantee the security of Europe. Japan, we also guarantee the security of Japan. There's no other parts of the world in which we guarantee the security of a country or region. In the case of Japan, it allowed the Japanese military budget to be very low until you get to the 90s and maybe the 2000s. It's grown a little bit, but that allowed for the Japanese industrial plant, the factory system, to become very productive because the resources were devoted to the economy and society as opposed to the military. History doesn't repeat itself, but often it rhymes. And this is just summarizing. The United States were close to each other before World War II, well, before the 1930s, I should say. Then, of course, the war was incredibly brutal. Already talked about that. And then after World War II, history sort of cycles back on itself. It goes back to that period of harmony and cherry blossoms, late 19th, early 20th century. Lunch with books. Got to have more books. This is written by a friend of mine, so I'm biased because she's a friend of mine. Sayuri Shimizu's Japanese. Did research in Japanese archives and U.S. archives. Basically, the argument of the book is the U.S. and Japan have had times of harmony and times of conflict, but one thing that's constant is baseball. And it goes way back before World War II. She talks about even the 1890s and the early 1900s. The Japanese are great baseball players, and by the 20s and 30s, they're inviting over, paying for part of the cost, these pro teams and minor league teams. They can't get a pro team, let's get a minor league team, because they were so obsessed with baseball. Who's that on the right? Baseball fans? Joe DiMaggio. Okay, another excellent book, Emily Rosenberg. If you're interested in how Pearl Harbor has been remembered, why is it so powerful in people's minds? Well, one reason it was so brutal and was so surprising, right? That's the obvious point. But there's a lot of other reasons why it is something that resonated with the United States. Part of it goes back to what I was saying before about that dinosaur, right? Like he was whacked and cut off the tail, and the country, it was the one time the country sort of, reared up and fought a total war for 4 years. And so she explores a lot of these issues. I think this is the best single book on Pearl Harbor I've ever read, actually. If you're interested in, especially if you're interested in how things are remembered. It talks about the Pearl Harbor attack and its military history, diplomatic history, but also talks about, why are we having this talk today? 80 years later, we're still talking about it. Clearly, it's important for American memory. This book goes into that. Thanks for your interest. I should mention one more book I didn't have a chance to include. It's by Gordon Prang. It's called At Dawn We Slept. And this guy was amazing. He researched the war for like 35 years. He died, unfortunately, just before it's published, but he had a terminal illness. So he had his colleagues finish the book for him. So he did a lot of work in Japanese sources as well. I don't think he spoke Japanese, but he had them translated. And a lot of work in American sources. It's a very thick book. I didn't get through the whole thing, but it's a very good read. At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prang. I'm betting it's in this library because it's one of the most important books on Pearl Harbor you're going to find. But with that, open up to questions.
In your looking at Pearl Harbor, did you ever run across the story that at the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay, some people wanted it to be done on the deck of the USS West Virginia.
Oh, really?
But Truman, the president, said it's going to be on the Missouri.
I don't know that detail.
And I read somewhere that when they did bring up West Virginia to rehab it and use it in the war, they found some of the watertight compartments that men had survived for 3, 4, 5, 6 days.
Yes.
Because when she went down, she just settled down into the mud. Whereas the Oklahoma turned belly up and they could come through the hull.
Right. The first part of what you said, I don't know, but of course Truman was from Missouri, so maybe that was his bias. The second part, I do know a little bit about. It's a friend who's working on a book on this. And you're exactly right, that he says they lived to January, the first week of January. It's hard to believe, 1942. And I don't know more details of that because he's like writing the book. I can't tell you anymore. That is true. They lived for a long period of time in the airtight containers.
There was an article that just this past weekend in the Wall Street Journal about the first Japanese POW.
Oh, really?
Almost a full page.
Oh, huh.
He was on one of those little miniature submarines
Okay.
that was going to sneak into the harbor and torpedo the battleships.
Right.
He was captured alive.
That's it. I didn't find
He
anything.
lived to be in, well, he was a prisoner of war from December the 8th on until the end of the war. Then he was repatriated to Japan, but his relatives never wanted to have him back because all the ones that didn't come back from those 3 or 4 subs were national heroes.
Right.
He lived to be in his 90s, but he wouldn't have committed suicide after we captured him, but we wouldn't let him.
Yeah. Wow.
He lived to be 90-something, but his family wouldn't even acknowledge his death when he died because he had come back alive.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I did. Back? The Roosevelt didn't know about the attack? Well, basically, he was relying on the intelligence community, the Army Signals Intelligence Service, and they didn't have any information for him. I mean, basically, it goes back to what I know I keep harping on this point, but I think it's really important, is that, there's a mindset in governments, just like today there's a mindset. The mindset was, there's no way the Japanese could pull off it. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't do it. They're just not, their military isn't good enough. It's not, and they would never be so audacious, right? And so there's no evidence that, I don't think any historian has found that Roosevelt knew of the attack, or anyone knew the attack. Now, it's important to keep in mind, like with the intelligence community, the spy gathering community in the United States, both then and today, I mean, information was coming in about a Japanese attack, a possible attack, right? But of course, once you get that mindset thing again, it's like, well, if it's going to be an attack, it's probably in the Philippines. Of course, the Japanese attacked the Philippines the day after. The Philippines weren't that prepared either, so I don't think they even really took that seriously as they should have. So it's this mindset that they're going to attack somewhere, probably. They've already attacked, most of Asia, as I have in my slide. I'll go back to that slide, that map, which is really important. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and it's going to just keep getting bigger, right? So they're going to attack somewhere, but there is no evidence that anyone knew it would be Pearl Harbor, or very little evidence. I always say, I hate to say no, but I've not seen, and most historians who are, I think, really good historians and thoroughly researched this say there's no evidence of Roosevelt.
Yep. As you said, the main reason for the attack was to cut off resources from the United States.
Yeah.
I always heard that scrap steel.
Yeah.
All that oil.
Yeah.
What was the point by attacking the U.S.? If it had been more successful, they could have delayed the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
Response for many years.
Yeah.
If they even responded.
Yeah.
But what was their intent to make up the resources? So the Philippines to unmolested and that sort of thing?
That's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer, I'll be honest. So I don't know if they had a plan B. But what I have read is that the Japanese felt their backs were up against the wall. It's like, this is something we can do to buy time. What are we going to do with that bought time? If I was an expert in Japanese foreign policy or Japanese military history, maybe I could tell you, but I don't think they had a very clear idea of what they would do with that time they were going to buy. It was just basically intimidate the United States, keep them out of the war for 6 months or a year, and then we'll rethink it. So,
Is the Philippines resource rich?
No, not really. They're very poor.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're foodstuffs, but not like oil.
Now, I've always heard, I just want your opinion on that we build up after the war, we build up the steel mills that the Japanese didn't fix, all right. That's why we're wrong.
Well, I don't think you could be as specific as to say we built up the steel mills of the Japanese, but basically we paid their military bills. And so then the Japanese, the way the U.S. ran the occupation, which allowed for good U.S.-Japanese relations, was we'll give you the money and you have to tell us in general how you're going to use it. But we're not going to tell you steel, we're not going to tell you radios, we're not going to tell you TVs. Just give us a general idea. All right, you're going to put so much in heavy infrastructure, so much in light infrastructure, and then you do it on your own. So I think the decision on the part of the Japanese was their own. They thought they had a comparative advantage in steel. And again, I don't know. I know they had a secret trading agreement with the Chinese for a while, which only came out later on. Probably getting raw material from Manchuria, like iron ore from Manchuria, would be surprised. So I think that the U.S. didn't want the Japanese to beat us economically, but they didn't stop it either. So.
Why did you pay this?
Well, basically, that's a very good question. But it all comes down to the Cold War in East Asia. That once China, communist China goes, that's like a huge chunk of Eurasia, the largest country in the world becomes communist, with the Soviet Union. And you also have North Korea. Japan was encircled. And so, from the point of view of U.S. Policymakers, this is very clear in the documentation there. And they said it publicly at the time, actually. It's like, we've got to have Japan on our side. We're going to pay their bills because they're anti-communist. If Japan goes to communism, our Asia policy is totally gone. So they're our lifeline, really. Publicly, they didn't make it sound so dramatic, but in internal documents, they said, we've got to keep Japan on our side at all costs, and we're going to do whatever it takes to rebuild them, including paying their military bills. And I say paying the military bills. We have a security arrangement to guarantee their security. We do give them military aid, a lot of that, but that's gone down since the end of the war. So, a good question.
What do you think of the incident that's been portrayed 2 or 3 times in movies about Pearl Harbor, of the Army radar station detecting large flights, of planes coming in, and they decided it was by the B-17s.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that detail, but I think, again, it comes back to this idea that the mindset of part of U.S. officials, and even lower level officials, there's no way the Japanese would do this because they wouldn't be so audacious, and there's no way they could do it because they just don't have the military infrastructure to do it. So it was this poo-pooing of the Japanese threat, I think, was pretty much the mindset of American officials. And again, I mean, it's important to keep in mind, you have to look at it the way they looked at it back in that time. If you're the military, and U.S. military, and you have limited resources, you're like, okay, the chances the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor are like tiny or zero. The chances they're going to attack the Philippines or other places is really high. So we're going to focus on that. So if you see B-17s in Hawaii, you're like, no, maybe they're Japanese, but they're off course. They meant to attack the Philippines. I mean, so
Even since they were that close, it wouldn't have changed.
right, it wouldn't have changed, right? Exactly. Sorry. Back.
How reliable do you think these statistics are about the rate of mankind?
Yeah.
A book written about 20 years ago by a woman named Iris.
Iris
Chan. And she did suicide several years later. Now, it's not like, NPR was on the ground there.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to dismiss it, but it was horrific.
I'm not sure of the statistics. There was a book written, I heard on NPR, actually, like, I'd say 10 years ago, more recent, which seemed like it was a very good book, obviously very, very sharp. And so that book, which I don't know the name of, would probably be a better source, because this story grew up 10 years ago, with a lot of research in China, excluding Chinese, and in the United States. So I don't know. I just went to a few websites and other sources, and I found that trend. But the Raven King was also, I don't want to say it was like the Chinese Pearl Harbor, but it kind of was. I mean, it was like this. It's like after that point, the Chinese are like, well, the Japanese are really out to get us, and we're really in deep trouble. Whereas before, the attacks were kind of bad and not as dramatic. So the Raven, I mean, I grew up calling it the Raven King, and I was called the massacre. So you've been trying for a while.
Oh.
Sorry.
I know time is almost up, but could you expand a little bit on how some of the thoughts were that the Japanese invasion of Manchuria started World War II?
Right, yeah. Well, basically, before 1931, the U.S. knew, and the world knew, the Japanese were building up a military power, but it was a very dramatic takeover of a huge chunk of China. So, also, Manchuria had been like a crossroads going back to the great imperial game of the late 19th century, there was Russian railroads there, the British were there, the French were there. And so it was like a really big deal at the time. And the way it was done too, it is, well, it sort of goes back to the sneak attack, right, idea, that the Japanese created an incident. And it became pretty clear that they blamed it on the Chinese. They said that the Chinese attacked us first. And so we had to take over the whole place, and we had to make it a whole colony. No one believed this, right? But still, it was a very sort of underhanded way of doing it. The United States and the world basically said, we're going to cut off trade. There was, I'm sorry, backtracking again. There was a lot of calls for let's boycott Japan. Let's cut off trade. Let's strangle it in 1931. But then President Hoover at the time said, well, you put on sanctions that tough, it's going to lead to war. Are you ready to fight a war in 1931? The depression is like really, really bad. And so, and maybe people around the world did not want to fight a war in Asia because of the worldwide depression. So it was basically the Japanese realized they could get away with it because the world was too concerned with depression. So.
As I recall, the attack in 31 on Manchuria was actually done by a faction of the Japanese army.
Exactly. Right.
They blew up about 6 feet of railroad track.
Yeah, exactly.
And claimed that the Chinese had done it.
Yeah. Yes.
Because there was a big struggle going on in Japan between the civilians and the military, and the emperor, of course, in between the two, trying to influence the future of Japan. And then they thought that Manchuria was their future.
Right. And also, it's a very good point. The factions of the military, they did not get permission from Tokyo. They just did it because they wanted it, right? And so then it's a typical case of how imperialism works, I would say. This is my view of imperialism. The leadership of Tokyo could say, we're going to disavow these guys, court-martial them, and apologize to China, apologize to the world. This is a mistake, right? Or they could embrace it and say, we're going to go with it. And that left, and it worked. So it's like, oh, well, then maybe one day other parts of China. So.
Did they get into Korea?
Yeah, Korea was 1910. That was the first.
Why did they do that too? I mean, if they weren't expanding, they weren't trying to.
Yeah, right. But there had been 20 years. They were expanding. People knew it, but there was a sort of feeling of like wishful thinking. Like maybe they'll just stop with Korea, which was not true. And the Japanese made the case, oh, Korea is a special case because it's so close to us. And the United States actually tacitly went along with that. The United States officials said, well, we're not really happy with this, but we realize that Japan has made a case that it's a special case, so it doesn't really count. It did count, but that was the deal. Right, exactly. It's sort of like the piecemeal tactics. So some would say it's a strategy on the part of the Japanese. They thought this out. Others would say, well, it was just kind of like the Japanese government's thinking up on the fly. All right, we'll take Korea, and we'll see what happens. And they wait 20 years. Take Manchuria, the world gets angry, and then the world kind of forgets about it. Then in 1937, so that's
kind of scary what you're saying. In 20 years, they forget about it. And so are we ever going to really trust the Japanese? How can we? Here we are, 80 years. It's 80 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that you get into the broader point. I would say, as a historian, maybe it's kind of cynical. Can we really trust anyone? I mean, I think about listening to the radio driving up here. I mean, those Russian troops on the national border of Ukraine.
Yeah.
You know, after the Cold War, like when I was finishing my dissertation in grad school, there was this thought that U.S.-Russian relations are going to be great, and they were pretty good. Boris Yeltsin comes over here, he's buddies with George Bush, he's buddies with Clinton, and so yeah, I mean, there's sort of an amnesia, which is scary. Yeah.
Can I just say why that's going on right now? And
Yeah.
Uyghurs in China. So why don't the Muslim people stand up for their own people that are being held hostage?
Yeah,
In
well,
China?
some are, yeah.
But I don't see any forces. And
Yeah.
why does America have to say, we're not going to take part in the Olympics? To go back. I mean, okay, we're not going to go to the Olympics. Our athletes are going to perform, but not us. Why can't we do something about that? Why doesn't the world do something about that?
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point. I mean, there's so many things going on in the world, and people have to prioritize. And in 1931, that's what people said with Manchuria, because that was seen as like the big kahuna. That was like, if we don't stop Japan now, they're going to take over more. They did. But then there's other things going on, like the Depression, and Europe was a focus, and so how much we care about Asia anyway. And so for a variety of reasons, things make it to the top of the party list, and then sometimes it's so it's very hard to, you have to look at each individual case. It's sort of hard to generalize about, why don't we do more about it in certain situations.
We sit here and say, for 20 years, you see this cycle,
Right.
here we are. It's 4 times since.
Well, those who don't study their history are condemned to repeat it. You've heard that before. And those who study history are condemned to repeat it anyway. So we're all here studying history. We're condemned to repeat it anyway. So sorry about that. Thank you for your interest. I'm not an expert on U.S. Japanese or U.S. Asian relations, but I've taught U.S. foreign relations for a number of years, and I've taught World War II for Harvard years. So happy to present today.
Thank you.